Good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Active Listening, Lost Art or Learnable Skill. I'm Lynn Osborne, Director of Business Development at the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare, and your moderator for today's session. The Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare is a national leader in the movement to make compassion a vital element in every patient-caregiver interaction. Before we begin the formal presentation, let's go over a few details about the webinar. The Schwartz Center Compassion in Action webinar series is funded in part by a donation in memory of Julian and Eunice Cohen. Today's program will be 60 minutes. The first 40 minutes will be presentation, followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. Today's program is being recorded and will be available on the Schwartz Center website a week after the session. Please note that attendees are participating in listen-only mode, but can interact with the speakers and me by using the questions pane, which should be appearing on your screen. If you have questions, just type them into the questions pane and send them to us, and we will address as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. We'll also be polling the audience during this session, and we hope you'll participate in using this interactive tool. As you exit the webinar, you will receive an electronic survey that we ask you to take a minute to complete so that we may capture your assessment of today's program. Your feedback is really important to us. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and our host for today's session. Dr. Beth Lown is an Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and the Medical Director of the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare. Welcome, Beth.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Lynn, and thanks all of you for joining us for our 2016 webinar series on compassionate collaborative care, what we're calling the Triple C. In January this year, during the first webinar of this series, I introduced the Triple C model and its associated attributes and behaviors. I described some of the science of compassion and empathy and discussed why compassion is a source of reward and an antidote to burnout. The framework explains some of the key values and skills that help us offer compassionate and collaborative care to patients, families, colleagues, and coworkers, while also sustaining ourselves and our sense of happiness and meaning in work. A full description of these qualities and skills is available on our website. Each month, the Schwartz Center will be offering a webinar by experts on different aspects of the Triple C Compassionate Collaborative Care model and framework. This month, we're going to be focusing on active listening. Today's program will help you understand that patients continually indicate that their ideal clinician is one who listens, yet at the same time, their complaints that doctors don't listen is ubiquitous. So this webinar will explore this paradox by addressing what listening actually is in clinical settings, its importance and its impact, and whether or not listening can be taught and actually learned. Today, we're honored to have as our speaker Dr. Abraham Fuks, who is an expert on this topic. Dr. Fuks is a graduate of the Faculty of Medicine at McGill University, where he obtained his MD-CM in 1970. Dr. Fuks served as Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at McGill from 1995 to 2006. He was a visiting professor in the Department of Social Medicine at Harvard University in 2007, 2008, and he's currently a professor in the Department of Medicine at McGill. He has an ongoing scholarly interest in the language of medicine and its metaphoric structure, and in the co-constructed narratives of doctors and patients. He's currently engaged in teaching medical students and developing the physicianship curriculum at McGill. So with pleasure, I'll invite Dr. Fuks to begin.
Dr. Lown, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of this series, and I'd like to thank all our colleagues for signing in. So let's jump right into the issue, which is, what is active listening? And more importantly, what are the objectives for today's workshop? First, I'd like to convince you that listening in a clinical setting is related to listening in ordinary daily life, but with some very special features that make it important for us as caregivers to be aware of those elements. I hope that by the end of the session, you will be convinced, as I am, that listening is the foundation of the clinical method, no matter what healthcare discipline we work in. I'll share with you some of the methods we've learned that we use to teach clinical listening skills, in our case to medical students, but of course the lessons are valid for anyone in any aspect of healthcare delivery. For fun, towards the end, I'll share with you a series of taxonomies of deafness found among caregivers and the causes for those. Although it's intended partly to entertain, I think it also serves to provide lessons about what listening ought to be and what happens when it's not carried out appropriately. So let me start by telling you about a project carried out by my colleague Donald Boudreau at McGill University and a team of colleagues. They, as we all are, we're teaching medical students how to become doctors, as many of you are in the audience, teaching all kinds of students to become healthcare professionals. So Dr. Boudreau thought, well, let's ask the consumer, so to speak. I don't like the word, but let's ask the patient and the family, what does a good doctor mean to you? What are the characteristics in your mind of a good caregiver, a good doctor? And Dr. Boudreau and colleagues interviewed 58 patients, asking in a semi-structured interview setting that very question. So to make it interesting for all of us, we're going to move to a polling question, which is on this slide, and I'll turn it over to Lynn to take it forward from here.
Okay, thank you, Abe. Before we open the poll, we're asking you a question within a question. We're asking you not what you think, but what you think others think. So just if you could answer from that perspective, that would be helpful. So what do you think was the most common response from patients and family members to the question, what makes a good doctor? Is it medical knowledge, diagnostic skills, ability to listen, or technical and procedural skills? So if you could select from, again, what did other people think was the most important, we'd love to get your feedback. And I'll give you just a few seconds more to fill in. Again, what do you think the most common response was from patients and family members to the question, what makes a good doctor? Okay, coming in. And I think we're almost ready to close the poll. All right, let's go. We've gotten a good response rate. Thank you so much. So what our audience, Abe, is telling us is they think that the answer that folks gave was 18% medical knowledge, 5% diagnostic skills, 72% ability to listen, and 4% technical and procedural skills. What do you think?
Well, I'm delighted because the answers that our audience chose, in fact, parallels or mirrors those of our interviewees. I must say that I and some of my colleagues were surprised that so few worried about technical and procedural skills and so few worried about medical knowledge, but almost all worried about the ability to listen. So if we can go on, I can give you some of their comments that we received. All participants, without prompting, and we didn't set it up so they had no clue that we're interested in listening, as this audience is, all the participants talked about the physician's listening skills. They talked about listening as the essential feature of good doctoring, and it was clearly in these interviews the dominant issue. It was a priority. But we learned a lot more. We learned that the patients and families understood the complexity and the richness of listening, and they appreciate that the skill is not simple. And we learned a wonderful phrase from some of our French Francophone patients and families, a lovely phrase in French, être à l'écoute. In other words, being in a state of listening. And it was a lovely expression of the fact that they understood that listening isn't a simple skill of one of the five senses. It requires a certain habit, a certain stance. And they also understood very beautifully that listening is not passive, it's quite active. Other comments that we received when we said to those patients and their families, why is listening so important? Why do you put it so high on your list of important elements of good doctoring? Well, they knew the simple answer that, well, you need information for diagnosis. You need to understand what ails the patient. But they went beyond that. They understood that listening is therapeutic. And here I quote from some of the data, because sometimes listening to a person will cure half of one's problems. Or the wonderful insight that talked about the therapeutic value of listening beyond the information gathering. They understood, our participants, that the doctor-patient relationship depends specifically and clearly on listening. And we heard a word that will recur again through this talk in the next phrase. If you listen to the patient, you give the patient respect. And that word, in many guises, recognition, respect, acknowledgement, recurs again and again as one of the meanings, one of the markers, one of the messages you send when you listen actively. Another one said, when my surgeon listened, I knew that he put my values first. They acknowledged that physicians and other caregivers are busy people. And one of them said, well, my doctor doesn't have much time, but boy, in those 2 minutes he listened to you, you had the impression he spent an hour with you. They began to understand, and they expressed it quite clearly, that listening does many, many things and is not simple at all. We had other wonderful comments. One of our participants said, well, if they close their ears to you, then what are they understanding? Only what they're seeing, right? And seeing is not everything. And I'll come back to that later. There was a wonderful, insightful phrase from one of the patients. And they also knew quite clearly, what some of us forget, eye contact is always important. If you shake someone's hand, you look them in the eye and say hello. So they understood that listening is an active process, and it's a social interaction, and not simply the notion we sometimes think of, well, let's sit back and listen to the music. They understand that clinical listening is quite different. And the last phrase I'll share with you was a very powerful one, that you need, or we need, to be recognized, not just as person, but as unique person. And they're sort of saying, if you don't listen to me, how do you know who I am? So it came as a surprise to me, and the paradox that Beth discussed earlier. We all talk about listening is important, and yet a recurrent complaint, and in fact, it didn't start 10 years ago or 20 or 50. If you read the older medical literature and historic accounts, patients complained of their physicians not listening for well over 100 years. So when faced with a paradox, if you're an academic, you run to Medline, as I did. So I searched for communication in its various guises, and I was delighted. 100,000 hits. I said, how about teaching? Well, it's reassuring. There's 56,000 papers or more on teaching. How about speaking? I said, well, almost 10,000. How about listening? 5,000. Wow, that's contrary to the old idea that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And of course, the ratio here is reversed, but that's what the world says. So I said, how about if I combine teaching and listening? What do I get in an overlap? And the answer was a paltry 169 papers. This is a 10-year span on the biomedical literature. So I said, look, there must be something in those papers. So I read the abstract of all 169, and only 10 were relevant to what we're talking about today. The rest of them have to do with schools for the deaf and the literature from speech pathology, otolaryngology, and so on. So the medical literature on teaching listening is very, very skimpy. 10 papers over a span of 10 years. Somewhat embarrassing. So I talked to my colleagues in the law school and found a paper that one of them pointed out to me. 70% of our time, our waking time, is spent in communication. And someone did a study and showed, well, 42%, almost half, is spent in listening. That was reassuring. But then the author said, well, listening is the type of communication when engaged in the most. And obviously, we learned that first before, as children, we learn how to talk or read or write. And yet, it requires a skill we are taught the least. So what is true in medical school and perhaps other schools of health care professional training is also true in law schools. We take it for granted. And this paradox was very disturbing to me. So now we have two paradoxes. Patients know listening is important, and yet they say, my doctor doesn't listen, or doctors don't listen. And this paradox in the literature. So I said, what's going on? So let me suggest that it isn't individuals who are at fault. It's the backdrop of our social culture. And what do I mean by that? Well, in our culture, listening is second to seeing. We believe that eyes are better. Now, how do we know that? Well, if you go to a courtroom, they say, I'm an eyewitness, and then you can get on television. But if you say, this is what I heard, they say, oh, well, that's hearsay evidence. When you want to say, you have to believe me, you say, I saw it for myself. We talk about turning on the light. I see what you mean. Seeing is believing. We talk about the Enlightenment. So in our culture, seeing is more important than listening. Aristotle, going way back to the ancient Greeks, he did say sight is the sense above all others. Yet, he said, and I quote a translation, for developing thought, hearing incidentally takes precedence. So we understood, as many of us have forgotten, yes, seeing is powerful, but hearing has a dimension that is different and important. Another feature is the next one. In our culture, listening is second to speaking. We have courses on rhetoric and public speaking. And I did a search through a website of the International Listening Association. There is such a group. And they showed that American or North American high schools have about 5,000 courses in public speaking across the country, and fewer than 20 on listening. So speaking is a big deal. Speaking is macho. If we describe someone as a leader, we say he or she is a great orator, a great speaker. They gather attention. Some of us are watching the American primary season right now, and of course, what is it all about? It's speaking. We never ask if those who are going to lead the country are good listeners. We just want to know if they're good speakers. So in our tradition, and particularly in a North American televised tradition of cowboys and those who are macho, speaking is seen as important, and listening is, to my mind, misunderstood. It's not seen as a challenge. It's seen as passive. All you do is sit back and listen. But of course, we also pay attention to it in very strange ways. Many of us have said, as I might have said, well, I'm about to give a seminar today. I'm feeling a little anxious. But I'm sure none of you who tuned in to listen said, I'm about to listen to a webinar. I'm feeling a little anxious myself. Because listening is not seen as active, as engaged. Listening is seen as, well, you sit back, and if you get it, you get it. And yet hearing, by receiving speech, to quote someone, permits us to mediate between minds. And a very old and wonderful clinician said, Hiram Sparrow was his name, to quote him, the eye is for accuracy, but the ear is for truth. So listening is difficult. It requires maturity, and it requires a shift of relationship. In other words, it requires us as caregivers to not say, we're important and I'm here to help you. It requires us to say to the people for whom we're providing care and service, we are here as partners. How can we work together? And listening then becomes as important, and I would submit more important, than speaking. But it's not easy. And I think if we turn to our analytic colleagues, if you can find a psychoanalyst these days outside New York, ask him or her. And they appreciate that listening is key. And so we joke from time to time about the Freudian couch and the analyst isn't looking. But boy, oh boy, the analyst is certainly listening. And we can learn a lot from our colleague as to why that's important. So with this socio-cultural paradox, I said to myself, what does this all mean? And I started to look at and try and answer the following questions. First of all, what is listening all about? And one way it was easier for me to understand it is to answer the question, why am I listening? So let me offer you some definitions or descriptions. There is such a thing as informational listening. I'm at the airport, I need to know about my flight. Or I'm with a patient, I need to take a history. In other words, once I have listened, I will know what to think. That's important. The second one is what I call transactional listening. I'm a broker, I'm a surgeon. Once I listen to you, my client or patient, then I'll know what I need to do. So that's important as well. But there's a deeper dimension that our patients in the survey explained. They talk about relational listening. And for me, that is what characterizes a teacher, a caregiver, in this case a physician, but truly anyone in a healthcare profession or the helping profession. Relational means once I have listened, I will know better who you are, and therefore what I must be to do what I need to do. And that is what I call relational listening. So let me dig into that a little more deeply. So how do we describe listening? Once I've described why we do it, how do we do it? First of all, there is a species which is important to us that we call attentive listening or clinical listening. There are many synonyms for it, but all of them are important. First of all, attentive listening, by describing it as a perceptual, cognitive, and social act, means simply that not only is it perceptual, that is, we need to hear and perceive, we also need a cognitive skill, that is, we need to think about what we're hearing. And third, and equally important, we need to provide the signals that say, I hear you, I'm listening. And that social response is crucial. All of us have experiences where we're talking to someone on the phone and all of a sudden you have no feedback. And you start to say, are you still there? Because we become uncomfortable as speakers. We realize that no one is listening. So it's important for the listener to keep on saying, I hear you, please go on. And so part of that is very much a social act, an interaction. Secondly, as it's very clear now, attentive listening is active. It is not passive, and we'll learn more about that over the next 20 minutes or so. Third, attentive listening is triadic. What do I mean? It involves the speaker, the utterance, what you're listening to, and the listener himself or herself. And clearly, in our case, the speaker is the patient or family for whom we're providing care. So don't forget that there are two people involved and one body of material, the content and the behavior. It's not only words that count, it's what the words mean, the metaphoric allusions. What does the patient really mean when he or she says, I'm not feeling well? Is that physical? Is that emotional? Is psychological? There's a lot behind that, and we need to listen to what words does the person use. By paralanguage, we mean the other parts of language, the pauses, the sighs, the silences, the tone of voice that changes, that suggests discomfort or anxiety or fun. And also, as we learned from Dr. Hall in a previous webinar, the nonverbal cues and signs, so-called body language. clearly very important. And I'll get to another part of body language in another slide or so. So how else do we describe attentive listening? It requires receptiveness. And by that I mean it requires not only our ability to receive, but our ability to transmit the fact that we're receiving, the fact that we're listening. And we learn to do so without interrupting. We learn to do so by providing sometimes the facial cues, the smiles, the eyebrows of recognition, and we have to be very mindful of the signals we're sending, because sometimes we send the wrong signals and sometimes the right ones, and I'll address that in a couple of slides. We have to understand what spoken language is all about, how it works. And we also need to learn, and we learn with time, an ability to move between open-mindedness, I'm here to listen, and yet an awareness of inference. In other words, we're not blank slates when we listen. We're listening for the meaning of the patient's words and what, in fact, they're trying to tell us. We're also listening so we can accomplish several things. The what, that is, what are the concerns of the patient? The how, meaning what information can I use? The why, the detail of the history, the physical exam, which in its own sense is a mode of listening, of course, with a stethoscope or with hands and ears and so on. And the why, of course, is how to help. So this open-mindedness is an interesting issue because, yes, we need to be open-minded, but not totally unengaged, because, of course, that's not attentive or active listening. And all our participants understood that we need information for diagnosis, but they understood that we need to understand and sense the personhood of the person before us. We can only do that not only by listening, but transmitting the fact that we are listening. Other significant descriptors is, again, to realize that attentive listening is not neutral. If you want to listen to a symphony on the radio, that's fine. Even that's not neutral, but that's another discussion. But in the clinic, in a patient's home, in an office, in a hospital, attentive listening is not neutral. It can have positive impact on the patient who suddenly says, well, my caregiver cares, truly is a caregiver because he or she is listening. And the relationship is thereby created, constructed through that act of listening. But remember, it can also have a negative impact. And if you roll your eyes, or you suddenly, the patient senses that you're not really listening, and we all know that that's very easy to detect, the relationship gets damaged and sometimes irreparably. So attentive listening means that we become different. We become different people. Now, how do we do it? So let me give you at one shot a whole array of types of listening and suggest to you, as soon as we get to the end, that only one of them is meaningful to us as clinical caregivers. Turn waiting is, of course, not listening. It says, I'm waiting for you to finish so I can talk. Defensive listening is what lawyers learn. Critical listening is fine for a music critic. Judgmental listening is for teachers who are not good teachers who are there to grade the students. And skeptical listening is fine if you're an academic philosopher. Rhetorical listening means precisely that. You're waiting for your turn, or you're a politician, in which case it's more rhetoric than listening. And the bureaucrats like record-keeping listening. None of those are useful for caregivers. They're all valid in their sphere. But for caregivers, we need to talk about attentive or deep or relational or affiliative listening. Whichever word resonates for you is the word that works. And it is important clinically, although I would suggest later we can discuss during the question period, there are other walks of life that are often good models for us that we sometimes ignore. Now, there is a spectrum. And we all need to be somewhere on the spectrum, and hopefully as clinicians, we're on the right-hand side. In other words, the sphere of belief, we have to be open but not gullible. And patients and interlocutors with whom we speak or to whom we listen sense very quickly if we don't believe what they're saying. So we have to be very mindful of how, to use the vernacular, how we come across. So there are two ways to look at it and use the words. I use the word affiliative. The framework that Dr. Lown outlined for us is more within the Schwartz Center framework, which is compassionate listening. And these quotes come from articles that say, people are dying in spirit for lack of it. Another quote is, as we talked about earlier, it means, what do I need to be for you? And it means accompaniment or partnership. Those of you who learned or heard Dr. Lown's seminar when she started the series may remember an incident in an ICU where a young woman said, I don't want to be intubated again. And a clinician walked in who wasn't listening simply to those words, I don't want to be intubated. He listened to her subtext and said, why? And she said, I don't want to be sedated. I don't want to be restrained. And he said, okay, I hear you. And he said, okay, not only in words, but by actions. And he said, I'm here with you. That story, very moving one, said, A, I hear you, and B, I'm here for you. And that's the notion of accompaniment or presence or partnership. Dr. Hall talked about the nonverbal, and I won't dwell on that again today, except to note the mindful, line 3, that says we need to be mindful of our own nonverbal communication. In other words, what are the patients seeing and hearing when they watch us listen? What are the cues that we're sending back? Is it positive? Is it skeptical? Is it open-minded? So we have to be careful of our own nonverbal as well as verbal communication. The next slide is interesting because it comes from a slide on autism. And this is a slide set to teach young people who are autistic the very lessons we're trying to learn ourselves. Hear all the words, find out more, ask and say, this is what I heard, look towards the person. But the one on the lower left is my favorite. It says, turn off other thoughts. You can't listen to two things, that is, one verbally and one in your mind's ear. You have to stop worrying about the patient you just saw or the patient who's coming later or the fact that you have to pick up the groceries or you want to watch the primaries tonight. You really need to turn off other thoughts if you're going to listen. And this slide, although it's for children with autism, would serve us all well. Another one from the pediatric literature is equally wonderful because it says listening is with your whole body, not just the brain, but the heart. Don't fidget. Be aware of how you sit and be aware of how you look, how you seem to the person in front of you. There are some wonderful issues, and I won't belabor all of them. And this audio, as well as the slide deck, will be available if you want to review any of the material again or the references. But I found this wonderful quote talked about unjudging, open-hearted reception of the other, and it's a beautiful idea. And Mary O'Reilly says, and when we can't do it, we all talk louder and more stridently, and we get desperate. And at that point, we become overbearing. And at that point, we're not listening. And we can't be listened to. So when Trump truly listens to me, she wrote, my spirit begins to expand. We need to know that how to learn to listen for silences, or more difficult, is this patient a member of a minority group and has a past experience that's personal or an experience that he or she has heard about that says they never listened to people like us, so why should I expect you to listen? So we need to learn about the process of listening and learn about the experiences of the people who are our patients and clients. There's also a notion of content. What is the story I'm hearing? It's something we need to think about. As someone wrote beautifully, and there's a lovely article by Dr. Scott and colleagues in the Annals of Family Medicine that's very lovely to read. And I quote, is this a story of shame and they need you to listen? Is this a story of fear and they need you to be there with them? Is it blame and they need to hear that it's not their fault? So these are part of the issues that we ask ourselves. So what does good clinical listening do? Well, it creates the dyadic relationship for care, two people in a room together, recognition of the other, and there's that word again, respect. Listening is maieutic. What does that mean? It's a lovely word I learned by preparing for this material. Maieutic comes from the world of midwifery. It means to help give birth to. Very simply, the fact that you are listening out there allows me to speak. You give birth to my words. So you're the active agents. If you weren't listening, I wouldn't be here speaking. So it's a lovely idea that I learned, and it's worth remembering. You can explore ideas if you listen. You can't explore them when you talk. And you can explore ideas over a broad range of issues. The other one I want to emphasize is that when you take, any of us takes a history and listen to a patient, the story that comes out is co-constructed by you, the caregiver, together with the patient. It's not one person's story. It's neither the patient's nor ours. It is a story that is joint. And I think it's important to understand that and to keep that in mind. It's not only the words we're co-constructing, but it's the meaning of that story to the two of us. So let's proceed now to slide 31. It also creates a conduit for healing, and I lost that at the end. So what else does it accomplish? Well, it leads to relational outcomes. The relationship is key. Trust, feeling cared for, and knowing that we've been listened to and promises will be kept. The hope, that there is hope in this particular illness situation, and the physician knows the patient as a person. There are many challenges, and I'm moving along quickly because we have some examples that we'd like to show you. The challenges are we fall into the trap of paternalism or hierarchy. We know best. The doctor is in charge, or the caregiver, and you all know about the problems of hierarchy. And as I note in that last line, you shift one letter and empathic becomes emphatic. And we see it happen all the time. We have to learn to be comfortable with silence. It's not easy. It's a tough lesson. We have to remember, who are we in the moment? In other words, why are we there? What's our purpose? What's our goal? What's our role? And we have to figure out, why are we listening, and what we're involved with, and what is the situation. Med students tell us that they're not rewarded for listening well. One med student said, well, you can get away with being brusque. You can't get away with bad medicine. And by bad medicine, that student meant I couldn't give a differential diagnosis. That's bad medicine. But being brusque with patients, no one ever punished me for that. No one ever gave me feedback. We also denigrate the value of talk or listening. One student said, well, there's nothing I can do. I'm only, quote unquote, in second year, so I just talk to the patient, as if that's not important. But anyone knows that the patient found it very important. So let's move on to how we teach it. And we'll give you some examples. One of them really in small groups. One example is to take a patient transcript, if you have permission to use the story, write it out, and have three things happen. First, have one of the students in your group read the script. Have a second one role play the patient, and have the actual voice of the patient to follow. And in each one, do a comparison and ask the students to write notes of what they've just heard, especially the affective content, the emotion, the paralanguage. Have the students write written descriptions, not just tell you, but write down. They commit themselves when they write down the description. and try and do an audio with and without a video. And we can train the students to listen better if for that moment they're not watching at the same time. And then they can also learn the richness of both together and the complementarity between the two. We have to teach figurative language. In other words, patients don't just word. None of us use ordinary language. We use a metaphor every 25 words or so. So we have to learn about the figurative language patients use. And how do stories work? What is the logic, the actors, the tempo, the genre? We can turn on, and we must teach, as I mentioned before, tempo and pitch. Teach about listening for emotion. A patient with depression is clearly different from a patient who is bipolar in a manic phase. Those are easier to spot, but the extremes can sometimes teach us about the in-between. Word choice. Patients will always say, my doctor, my family. They might say my illness, but they'll never say my tumor. They'll say the tumor. And they're using the choice of words to distance from disease. It tells you about their fear and their concerns. Now let's give you a concrete example. We don't have an audio, but we have something better. And Beth Lown is going to read to you a script we got from one of the participants in the survey I told you about, the wife of a 42-year-old man about to go home after a week's stay in the hospital with a very serious cardiac illness with a heart attack. And this person happened to be interviewed by one of the interviewers in the study 20 minutes before they're ready to go home. Beth, over to you.
I know they're very busy and there's a lot of patients. I just find that they're always rushing. They don't have the time to kind of to spend with you. You've got to chase them. You've got to find them. You've got to hunt them down to actually ask your questions. When you have 20 questions, you know that you'll only get 10 answered because you kind of don't feel you have the time. The doctor has one leg out the door and one is inside. He's kind of listening to you and trying to do other things at the same time. We understand it, but we just wish he had more time. Because now he's checking out today, and I'm taking them home. I have so many unanswered questions, and I'm basically contacting people that have relatives with this kind of problem, and I'm asking them, am I not allowed to put any salt in this food, or can I put in some salt? Can I do this? I don't know. I don't even know if he can go home and lift his children.
Move over, Beth, thank you. And let's ask for your responses in the next polling question. Please select. Over to you.
Thank you. So based on the exchange that you've just heard, please select the emotion that you hear in the woman's voice, in Beth's voice. The 5 choices are anxiety, bewilderment, abandonment, anger, or comfort. Again, what emotion did you hear in Beth's voice as she was describing this experience? Anxiety, bewilderment, abandonment, anger, or comfort? We'll give folks a few little more seconds to go here. Nice job, Beth, by the way. Okay, not quite. We'll give it a few more. All righty, I think we can close the poll. Thank you. And we have votes for anxiety, 36%, 20% bewilderment, 38% abandonment, 6% anger, 0 comfort. So Abe, would you like to comment before we go back to the presentation?
Absolutely. Thank you to Beth as well. And she transmitted precisely what you hear in the original audio. A combination in all of 30 seconds, anxiety, bewilderment, abandonment, and there's an underlying tone of anger and, of course, certainly no comfort. So why is it that somebody who's taking her husband home, 43 years old, 2 kids at home, is being abandoned by one of our teaching hospitals? And that's part of the issue, and part of the answer is, were they listening? Now, we can't do this video, but we also use, sorry, but I clicked too quickly, it's simply a picture of a clinician interviewing a patient who actually is a simulated patient, an actor, and we showed the students a video clip of about 1.5 minutes and then stopped. and say, what did you see? What did you hear? Please write it down. Please describe it. And you hear changes of tone of voice. And in that video and audio, when the patient says, and the doctor says, what do you think you might have? And the patient answers with a great anxiety, says it could be, and his voice suddenly drops and he says cancer. And you suddenly hear that the timbre and tone have changed dramatically. So students will listen to that, but only if you bring it to their attention. And in fact, the earlier in the medical school training, the more attuned they are, interestingly, to those kinds of shifts and changes. So let's go on for fun and look very quickly, we don't have that much time, about what I call impaired caregivers. These are not patients who can't hear. These are doctors or caregivers who can't hear. Well, there's a whole different variety, and I'll run through them quickly. Some is just what I call passive clinical deafness. The clinician just doesn't listen and doesn't particularly care. Another one is active. He or she listens, but too active. They interrupt after 18 seconds. Not a very helpful clinician. A third type is the one when he hears the word headache, he thinks he's on a drop-down menu from Microsoft and boom says x-rays, blood work, etc., and sees the drop-down menu with a one-word trigger and, of course, doesn't listen to why the headache, when the headache, etc., etc. Another kind I call acquired. There's specialty variants. It's like the cardiologist who can't listen because the stethoscope is scarred and all he does now is buy an ultrasound machine and that substitutes. A more complex type is interesting. This is a caregiver who hears but can't read the signals. Nothing wrong with his or her clinical ears, but the clinical brain is not processing. And you see that all too often. The patients will say, anxious, and the clinician misses it and says, how often do you fall? Instead of picking up the theme. There's some very nice material in the literature where the clinician and the patient are talking to each other and past each other, and the clinician isn't listening, misses the context, misses the anxiety, misses the patient. And I've seen surveys where the clinician in the room with the patient, and they're being taped as part of a survey, and the patient is crying, and the clinician never noticed it. Another type for fun, but it's only half in jest, reflexive clinical deafness. The caregiver hears his own or her own words, but doesn't appreciate the impact on the patient. That's a lack of self-awareness. And the last type for fun, a complete communication failure, a clinician who doesn't speak and doesn't listen. It's rather rare, but sometimes you find a dermatologist like that, with apologies to some of my colleagues. So let's go back to why. Does it make a difference? And there's a wonderful paper that looked at an entire series of values and surveys on the impact, and it's a review article, and the citation is at the bottom, with 17 papers being cited by that review, that good communication and good listening increases satisfaction with care by patients, their adherence to the treatment plan, their understanding and recall of what it is they're supposed to do when they get home, their ability to cope with their illnesses, their quality of life, and what they call the state of health. These are surveys, these are not stories, and they're wonderfully documented. The same paper says a patient has two needs. One, the need to know and understand, so he or she can better look after their illness or that of a member of their family, and the need to feel known and to be understood. There's another wonderful paper that's worth reading, and in this field, you can read older papers and enjoy them just as much as newer papers. This paper about Buehler and Buehler contrasts two kinds of clinical behavior. One they call affiliative, and the other one they call controlling, and I won't go over the details. You can read those. The controlling is one that begins to dominate and can't listen, exaggerates, bombastic, dramatizes, is argumentative, and probably a clinician or a caregiver who is not secure in their own skin and becomes a controlling feature, either of the caregiver, and sometimes we see it in teachers as well. It's a real disease of both caregivers and teachers when we shift from affiliation to control. Another wonderful paper talks about clinical hypocompetence, referring this time case to residents. And they said, you know, it's news to many of our house staff that a diagnostic interview should be therapeutic. And that comes as a surprise. The rituals of meeting, it's a beautiful phrase, is therapeutic for the affirms that the patient has not strayed beyond the bounds of civilization into the hands of the technician. And in the days of automatic MRIs, that's a serious problem. So how does the patient ever know that you're saying, I am with you, if you don't transmit it? And they also talk about the control style and that the patient's voice should be heard and little of the caregiver. And finally, I use a similar idea that Dr. Lam, when she uses the idea of the doorknob question, saying, you're walking into the room to see a patient. First you stop and say, why am I here? What is my goal over the next 20 minutes or so? You walk in and you look, and you listen, but you look both ways, because you need to look at yourself and say, what does the patient see or in my behavior right now? And am I transmitting the appropriate message? I also like this sign that says, not only stop, look, and listening, the railway sign, but also think about what you're hearing. And finally, listening is active. It is work, but boy, it's a real joy to be a clinical listener. And you can see that little picture. The joy of listening is quite substantial. And it really is one of the lovely privileges of being a clinician or a caregiver is the privilege of listening to the people for whom we're providing care. So let me stop there, and we can move along. Over back to Lynn.
Excellent. Back to Beth, I think.
Well, no, I want to thank you, Dr. Fuks. I think that was just a rich and lovely and wonderful discussion. You know, I know that there are a lot of questions from our participants in the queue line, and I'm going to wager a bet that people are going to say, listen, we don't have time for this. You know, I'm afraid to listen. I'm afraid to pick up on those subtle and sometimes implicit clues. What do we do? If we start to listen, we'll never finish on time.
So,
right on, Beth. That's one of my questions. Go ahead, Dr. Fuks.
It's a very important question, and it is probably the commonest, without being disrespectful, that's the commonest excuse for not listening, and to say it takes too much time. And the literature shows again and again that that's not the case. And if you listen and listen carefully without interrupting, you gather a lot more information in the same period of time, and then avoid recurring appointments, use of medication, misunderstanding by family members. And so the time saved by listening carefully comes back as an investment and pays off very quickly. Yes, it is the case that sometimes we hear things that we don't want to hear because we don't have time. But it is, after all, the case that sometimes patients only tell us the most important thing when we ask about it and towards the end of an interview and not the beginning. And if indeed you don't have time in that 15 minutes or 10 minutes that you're permitted to spend with the patient, book another appointment and say, here's why I'm doing it and here's what we'll talk about, and I need to hear more about that problem next time, but I haven't missed it and I do hear you. So we avoid and we use the pressure of time as an excuse. So use the other cues Dr. Hall talked about that extends the time psychologically. Sit down, look at the patient, never look at the computer screen, and never ever type while they're sitting in front of you. That's probably the greatest sin, because whatever time you're investing is slipping away and becomes a negative return if that kind of behavior is observed by the patient.
Excellent. Very helpful. So here's one. With phone conversations, are there differences in strategies for active listening? I think we're getting questions from folks who do much of their work over the phone.
Sure. That's a very good question and a very important one, because we're using technology like phones and time shifting and FaceTime more and more. And the answer is yes, we need to work with it. There's no point in saying we can't use it. But we have to recognize that we have to be even more attentive when we don't have the visual, because we're missing a huge number of visual cues. So all the more reason to listen very carefully for the paralanguages, the nuances, and all the more reason to say, not interrupt, but wait for the appropriate silence and say, if I've heard you correctly, here's what you've told me. Is that clear? Have I understood you well? So I think, yes, you need to work on the phone, but realize that you're working with only part of your senses. You don't have the visual amplifier of emotion, so to speak. You don't see, but you can hear an awful lot. And sometimes, paradoxically, we can learn from those who can't see how their hearing acuity has changed, not simply in acuity, but in richness of engagement. So yes, we do work on the telephone. We need to acknowledge that it's not as good as being in the room, and therefore compensate for the problems by extending the acuity of our hearing and listening senses.
Very, very good. And a related question that it speaks to one of your comments. Could you suggest tips for how to pause yourself before interrupting others?
We are all very uncomfortable with silences. We believe that a silence in a conversation must be immediately filled. And so I think the training we all need, and it is a matter of habits, and habits are, easier to gain than to break, is to simply pause and not speak for a beat or two, almost as a piece of music. Wait 2 bars and don't say boo. And then allow the patient to give you the signal that it's your turn. Allow the patient to effectively look at you and wait for you to speak, and speak only then. And they will send you that cue by what they say or what they show you from the look on their face or in their eyes. So it's a matter of training, and in the end to say, this is their time. And one model I sometimes use with the students, if you walk into a very high-end department store and you're about to spend a lot of money on a piece of clothing, rest assured that that salesperson will listen very carefully, because that person's commission depends on listening. So if that's the case for buying a fancy whatever it is, all the more so when we're clinicians helping patients deal with very difficult problems. I think we need to wait and wait for the cue to begin speaking.
Very helpful. I'm going to read a long statement here. Let's see. Thank you for this discussion. I was wondering if you had advice for protecting the patient-clinician relationship when the patient claims you are not listening while you are indeed actively listening but also disagreeing with them. An example may be when there is a disagreement on prescriptions, when a patient is requesting a medication such as a narcotic that you feel is not necessary. So it's a little combination of clinical care and the listening skill.
I think you have to ask yourself, why is there a disagreement? Is that prescription or the dispute the focal point of an underlying disagreement? In other words, is this an ongoing grumbling problem with that particular person? Or if this is the first visit, you still have to understand why the disagreement. If you're saying that this is simply, you're worried that this is a demand for an opioid prescription, for example, then you need to dig a little more deeply so as not to make the mistake that every young person, for example, with hemophilia, is simply coming in and claiming they have joint pain because they want a prescription for opioids. Sometimes they really are in pain. So it's not a simple answer I can give, but clearly one has to dig a little more deeply and to say, what's the nature of it? And again, you won't know the nature of the disagreement if you're not listening.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to have to take one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Does the increased use of texting and social media reduce clinician skills in listening?
My own answer is yes, although I have to tell you immediately it's not a data-driven answer. I don't have a survey. I can, however, tell you, and we all witnessed it, I had a class of wonderful medical students recently, 14 young men and women, very talented. When I asked them to sign in the admission sheet, most of them had to borrow my pen because they don't carry one anymore. They also don't carry watches. But I can tell you by contrast, when I ask them to do presentations, they're wonderfully visual. They use the web in ways that I don't master at all and will never master. They use YouTube. They use wonderfully appropriate material. I think we will lose something in the richness of communication because of social media and blogging. And as I said to my colleagues earlier as we were preparing, the paradox is we call it social media when I think it's a very asocial act when we do it all through a smartphone. But we do have to accommodate to it and learn the other methodology. So the short answer is yes, I think it's a problem. But B, we have to learn how to adapt because it's not going away. I do believe we therefore have to insist that when we're talking about patients in a hospital, we don't work with the chart or a computer. We go stand at the bedside. We work in the clinic. We do case presentations with patients present unless there's some reason not to. In other words, because social media is so prevalent, every chance we have as caregivers, as teachers, to do it face-to-face, we need to enrich that opportunity and use it and show our students why we're using it so they can learn how we work and not simply about what we talk about.
Wonderful. Beth, I'd like to turn over to you. Last comments?
Well, I just want to thank you so much, Shabe, for your depth of wisdom and experience and for sharing it with all of our listeners. And then we will go over what is coming up next in our series. But a big thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Abe and Beth. We'll hope that you'll join us for upcoming programs in the Compassion in Action webinar series, including The Alchemy of Empathy and Compassion, Transforming Stress into Meaning at Work with Eve Ekman on Monday, May 16th. Please visit our website to learn more about the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare and our membership program. And please save the date, October 28th and 29th, 2016, for our Harvard Medical School Continuing Education course, Compassion in Practice, Achieving Better Outcomes by Maximizing Communication, Relationships, and Resilience. Registration information is available on our website. We know you're very busy, and we very much appreciate your taking a moment to complete the electronic survey upon exiting today's program. As we value your input, I want to thank Dr. Fuks and Dr. Leon. Thank you to all of you for participating, and have a great day. That ends our program.